And I know that we've had a number of buyer representation sessions. And I know that the language and the new language in these agreements has been discussed at length. So I will ask you if you needed me to literally go over and review all of the new language, or if we could sort of skip that and move forward to something else. I'm pretty sure all of us have looked at the language change already. So what I really wanted to more than anything else is discuss and maybe do some role play, or the two major changes, right? The two major changes when it comes to buyer representation, one being the fact that moving forward, right, the new NAR practice changes dictate that we cannot show property, correct, without having a signed agreement, without having the signed agreement with a buyer. And that can be an agency agreement, that can be a transaction brokerage agreement, but we have to have something signed with a buyer before we can show any property, whether that be in person or whether it be a virtual showing. And so with that, what are your thoughts and what are your hesitations and what are your concerns about that?
I don't have like any concerns. I mean, I think the news has already put it out there enough that people are hearing it. So
Okay.
at least everyone that I've talked to.
I was about to ask, has anyone worked
Yeah.
with a buyer in recent days?
Yeah.
And has there been any pushback? So let's say, and do you mind if I pick on you, Chris? I'm gonna pick on Chris or anyone else for that matter. But I'm the buyer. Chris, yes, it's a pleasure meeting you, but I don't really feel comfortable signing an agreement right now. I just want to see this house. I just want to see this one house. Why do I have to sign something?
Well, rules for NAR have something signed by the buyers, with the buyers before we're allowed to even take you into the properties.
Okay.
So no matter what agent you go to, for them to do it correctly, you're gonna be asked to sign a document.
Okay. Does that document obligate me to work with you for any extended period of time?
It just depends on what we agree to. I can have you sign something that's just for today, and the properties that we look at today, or then if you're comfortable working with me from here on out, then we can extend that.
That's great, but I still don't feel like I need to sign anything. I just want to see this house. So think about it. What if someone actually said that to you? I just want to see this house.
It's not law.
It's not law, and that's what I was trying to get to, because I've heard a number of agents say new laws dictate that, we need, and the law has not changed. Our real estate license law has not changed. These are just practice changes, right, that are in effect for NAR members. So there are other real estate agents which we can still be fined for, right? And there are real estate agents that would be more than happy to open a door for you, right? That are not bound by these practice changes and by these new rules, right? So how do you then approach that, right?
I appreciate that I appreciate where you're coming from, but I have to explain to you that I could be fined, but for showing you properties that do not have some sort of agreement, even if it's just for this one property. If you'll just sign this, there's no obligation for you to stay with me after this home. After showing you the home, after you sign this and I show you the home, maybe we have a great rapport and you trust me enough to, I've earned your trust and we have a connection and you'll sign for a longer period of time, but there's absolutely no obligation.
Okay.
But I could lose my license. And like you said, I would even throw in there, I'm sure there's somebody that may show you the property, but I cannot risk it. I will not be one of those people. And I hope you would appreciate that fact.
But why do I have to agree to pay you 3%?
You don't. We can do the transaction broker agreement instead, and that's where you're representing yourself and I'm just showing you the property. But again, I'm willing to show you a couple properties. If you're not willing to commit to me, then I'm not gonna be committing to you.
Even if, like, I'm not looking to move here for like 6 months, so, I'm just trying to get to know the areas. So how does that work then, and do I have to pay up front? Do I have to pay you this today?
So you don't have to pay up front. right? We can sign an agreement for a certain amount. Let's say it's a 6-month agreement, right? You don't have to pay until and unless you purchase a home, right? And that cost will be paid at closing, correct? There are different ways in which I can be compensated, right? Sometimes the seller is willing to offer compensation, in which case I'll receive that compensation from the seller's side of the transaction. In some cases, the seller may be willing to offer some, right? And then maybe we can work with, or at least try to obtain some concessions that would cover the rest of that. But if we are unable to do so, right, then you would be responsible for that compensation at closing. Not today or not next month, but you would be responsible for that at closing. But I think it is in your best interest, right? And I don't know about anyone else, but I don't feel comfortable with telling them up front, I could be fined for doing this, right? I personally feel more comfortable with trying to build value, right? I feel that it's in your best interest. After all, when we start working together, you're going to share personal information with me, right? If we are not under an agency agreement, I don't represent you. I don't have to keep that information confidential, right? So it's in your best interest, not just mine, but in your best interest to have representation as you continue your search. Because by signing this agreement, my job, and I have a legal responsibility to protect your best interest at all times. And as a buyer, that's what I would want, right? Somebody that's looking out for my best interest. I feel more comfortable approaching it that way, right? Showing the consumer the benefit. Why are you of value? It's not about me. It's about you and protecting your interest, right? I'm not asking you to sign this document just because this new rule says I have to, right? I'm asking you to sign this document because it is to your benefit, right? Because by signing this document, I am legally bound, right, to provide these duties, right? I'm legally bound to do this on your behalf. So why would you not want someone advocating for you and only for you? I had one buyer say, well, I can just call the listing agent. I can just call the listing agent. Yes, you can, and that is an option that is available to you, right? However, do you think that is in your best interest? Please remember that. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say that, going off of that, couching it as that if you don't have representation, that how do you know you're not gonna say something? I mean, I wouldn't say it in those terms, but say it in a nicer way. How do you know you're not gonna give away information that's gonna hurt you in negotiation? I don't know
Correct.
how to say that in a way that's not gonna make the person feel like, I'm not trying to make them feel stupid, but they're not real estate professionals. So, I go to a loan officer, I'm not gonna, if he says, oh, you don't know how this works, I'm not gonna feel offended. I'm not a loan officer.
Right. Right. Well, and that's part of when they say I can just go to the listing agent. That's true, and that's an option that is available to you. But please keep in mind that that listing agent or the builder representative represents the seller, right? Their job and their legal responsibility is to do what is in the best interest of the seller at all times, right? Their responsibility is to get the best deal and the highest price for them. So do you think that that listing agent will have your best interests at heart? Right. So it's always a matter of, at least in my opinion, it's always a matter of framing it, okay, in a way that shows that consumer, right, that you are there for them and advocating only for them. It's about them. It's not about me. And truly, it's not about us. And I say this all the time, we have to do what's in the best interest of our clients, even if it's to the detriment of our own, right? I had a client once that we looked at property for 8 months. We looked at property for 8 months. And in the end, we came to a listing where the compensation for a buyer agent was only 1%. I had worked with them for 8 months. I only made 1%. Yeah. And I didn't refuse to show them the house because that's the house ultimately that they loved, right? But that's our job.
Well, we've all worked for whatever it was and listed in the MLS, right? Because it was very rare that you went back to your buyer and said, hey, I want this. But now I feel like everyone is going to be sending a compensation agreement for 3%. I think every buyer's agent is going to be sending a compensation agreement for.
If that's the case, then we're gonna have a buyer agency agreement that says 3%.
And so there's controversy about that. Do we have a right to ask for that? And
If your buyer has agreed in an agency agreement to pay you 3%, you
Right.
can ask for more.
No, I know that,
Or
but
vice
if
versa.
the listing agent says, hey, I want to see your buyer agency agreement, do we have to show that?
We haven't.
I mean, that's
determined
between
that.
me and my buyer.
Yeah, we were talking about that yesterday.
Yeah,
So if your buyer is financing, your lender is going to want a copy of the compensation agreement.
right.
But the listing agent doesn't have a right to it. That's what I was talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Agent, feel like we brought this up yesterday where it's kind of like listing agent against buyer agent. Well, show me yours first.
Yeah.
You know, but I want to see what you're offering before I show you what my seller is willing to do.
Was that the
So-
situation that you and I
Yeah.
spoke? Because the other agent asked me for a compensation agreement for
And she's representing the seller.
The seller.
100%
Oh,
seller.
yeah.
And then I speak out to Chris, and she told me I don't have to.
Yeah, that's what we're-
No, it should be coming from the buyer's agent.
Right, it should come from the buyer's agent. The buyer's agent is the one who's requesting that compensation.
I had it myself this morning where somebody showed my listing, they didn't ask me for a compensation agreement, but they did ask, what is your seller offer? So I reached out to my seller because my listing says up to whatever percent, and I reached out to my seller and I'm like, how do you want me to respond?
Mhm.
And they were like, you can tell them what we wrote on the listing for it. So if I had up to 3%, they give me permission to disclose 3%.
3%.
And so you didn't feel like when you did the listing, you put that in there in your conversation with them, you don't feel like you had the
Authority.
right to tell that without calling them
I
first.
wanted to make sure that they were okay with that, just because this is the very first call I've gotten about
I guess we're gonna have to discuss that up front and, you
it.
know,
Listing.
in the listing appointment, you know, stating if, you know, we have an agent call us, because what if you can't get a hold of your
Right,
seller,
right.
you know? Are you okay with me disclosing,
Yep.
you know, what you've agreed to here in writing in our listing agreement? And I think that's gonna be important and, you know, maybe have them initial that, you know, but they do, I think on there say that we can disclose that, right?
That's under concessions. Under concessions, it says
Right.
you're allowed to disclose.
Okay.
But not a compensation agreement.
It doesn't say anything about, because it, and again, I think this is where. it messes
There's
up,
some
is
gray
that
area.
too.
Yeah. It's the up to that is the
Yeah.
issue.
And I can see on both sides. I had a conversation with a listing agent this morning. He said, I'm doing something, and Julian said this yesterday, I'm doing compensation agreements for my seller that says he's agreed to 3%.
3%.
Because I feel like this is in my seller's best interest to advertise to the buyers, hey, we're offering this more.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, and if the seller has
think
told
that way
them,
too.
if the seller has said, yes, I'm okay with 3%, then there's no problem with doing that. As
That's
long
why-
as
that's what that
there's,
is for.
there's,
have
there's,
that conversation with your seller.
Right, right.
When doing these listing agreements, make sure that they're okay with you just putting that out there first, that they were offering this.
Mhm.
Again, if it didn't say up to, this, I don't think this conversation will be even.
It wouldn't be. So it's the ambiguous language of the attorneys that created the forms.
Yeah.
Because, well, and some have come about already, but that's a conversation for a different time. But that was one of the things. So the first hurdle is talking to that consumer and getting them to agree to sign, okay? Agree to sign something so that you can show them the property.
So like, if you have a buyer say, okay, 3%, you need 3%,
Mhm.
you know, I'm just talking.
Yep.
But you know, you would be okay with 2.5 or whatever. How can you, I don't want to say that to my buyer, but what if they ask me that? Well, I don't know. Can you just put 2.5? How can you say to them that it can change? I mean, everything is negotiable, whatever, but to stand firm at 3%, but yet knowing that it can change.
So I would simply say that my fee is 3%, right? My fee is 3%, and we will do I personally would say I will do my best to try to get that from the seller side of the transaction. If we cannot achieve that, right, we can always come back and revisit our agreement. I'm not willing to modify that now, but I am willing, should the circumstances dictate it, I am willing to come back and revisit. that agreement. Okay, because the buyer agency agreement says that I can only earn as much as, so if I put 3%, that's the maximum I can earn from this transaction. However, nothing says that I cannot amend it, right? There's a clause at the end of the buyer agency agreement that says we can amend this agreement at a later time. So you simply use the amendment, an addendum, sorry, to change that agreement. The same way we would use an addendum, for example, if your buyer ends up finding a new construction where that builder is offering $5,000, $10,000, whatever bonus, or 4% versus 3%, and you have an agreement for 3%, right? You can go back and use that addendum to amend your original agreement, as we were any other contract, as we would any other contract. So I'm not a proponent of saying, yes, I'll do it for less right up front. Right, let's go ahead and sign it at 3%, right? Should we have to revisit that, we can revisit it. Should the circumstances dictate that, we can talk about it at a later time, right? Because otherwise, if we say, sure, I mean, you're gonna constantly be cutting your compensation. Exactly.
Kind of have issues with
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we've all done that, right? We've all done that in the end where we're paying for something in order to get the deal to close, right? So if we start reducing at the front end, we lose money, right? Because the consumer doesn't understand. You know, they think if the commission is $10,000, we've just earned $10,000. Well, no, I've got to pay my taxes and I have overhead and I've taken pictures and I've done whatever else. So I'm not truly earning that $10,000, right? That's not my take home. So the goal is to not reduce it up front. But if you have to do it at a later time to make that deal work, sure, we can revisit that. We can talk about it, should it be necessary, right? I'm not opposed to discussing it. I wouldn't shut the door. I mean, my personal opinion is I'd rather make 2% than 0, right? I'd rather make 2.5% than 0 than not have the deal, but I'm not going to discount right at the front end. Okay.
I think it's gonna be a little bit more difficult for the virtual showings to say to someone that you need to sign this agreement. They're not here, you know. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah, I know.
Or use the transaction brokerage agreement, that one page,
You know,
we'll just put that property
I
address.
had that situation with the ones that signed with me,
Mhm.
because they were in Kentucky. And I just went through, Chris sent me a copy of the new agreement, and I just went through it and explained to them, you know, I cannot virtually show you any properties, and they were fine with it. They didn't have any problem at all.
I know
think
some
that's,
people won't,
Yeah.
but there are
I
people
think-
who, you know, I get people on the phone all the time saying, well, they just said on the news. And this morning again, they were all over the news. You know, and, you know, they said, well, I don't have to, you know.
And many times, and I've said to people, that's great, but unfortunately, you know, news anchors and what the news tells us is not always accurate, right? And you just go ahead and actually explain what those changes are and what those practice changes are. Because it's all about educating them, right? They just don't know. Sometimes they're simply not aware or they don't understand fully, right? So it's all about educating the consumer in the end. And I think through that education, eventually they'll come to understand. If you're willing to take the time to explain it to them, they'll come around. In my opinion, that's been in my experience, that's been the case, right? If you're willing to take the time and energy to explain it, they will come around. And if it's over the phone, again, do a one-day agreement, do a transaction brokerage agreement. You know, we're just going to date for a little bit. We're not getting married. Right?
Yeah.
You know, let's sign an agreement for a week. Right? Let's date for a little bit. And if after a week I have not shown you, I've not proven my value, the value that I can bring to you, then we can part ways. What's that? No. All right. The other thing that I wanted to talk about and really more get your opinion and how you feel about it, and do a little bit of role play on that as well. We've said that ideally we would like that compensation agreement to go to the listing agent or to the seller before we present an offer. Yes. So more and more people are talking about and are using seller concessions and the term concession almost synonymously with compensation right now, right? Because most agents feel that they have to somehow negotiate, right, their compensation through the contract. What is your opinion, number one? How do you feel about that?
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people that don't understand it because they're saying that they're doing both.
They're doing both.
Yes.
You have to be careful with that. Ideally, we want that compensation agreement signed, and we want our compensation to be addressed through a compensation agreement, rather than concessions. And that's just because, in my opinion, the entire language with concessions being on that contract is very ambiguous. And I think it can be detrimental to the buyer, ultimately, because you may come across a buyer that cannot afford to bring the additional 10, 12, $13,000, whatever the case may be, to the closing table. Or they may need those additional concessions to actually close the transaction for themselves. And now we're asking to use part of that concession, seller concession, to compensate us. So ideally, have your compensation addressed through a compensation agreement and strictly through a compensation agreement. And then negotiate seller concessions on behalf of your buyer, and not to pay your commission. Is there a question?
That's what I brought up earlier.
North Carolina is a little different. Our commission percentage has always been up to, and we have to do anything higher in writing with consent from the client. Yeah, you can't, correct. And up until this point, we have not been able to negotiate commissions on our offer to purchase either, right? It has only been since these practice changes that they changed our South Carolina offer to purchase, and included this new language, which in my opinion muddies the water. Absolutely, Carrie, you're absolutely correct. And it doesn't belong there in my opinion, right? Because that offer to purchase is a contract between the buyer and the seller, right? And our commission really should not, our compensation really should not be a part of that. But they've made it a part of it, unfortunately, right? They've made it a part of it. And with our new buyer representation agreement, you're correct. We've never been able to be paid more than, right, what has been stipulated in our agency agreement. And the only way we can do that is by amending that contract, So what if you received, let's say you're representing a buyer and you're going to present an offer. It's a purchase price of, you have a buyer agency agreement at 3%. Your purchase price is $250,000. You submit your compensation agreement before the offer to the listing agent. Okay. And they refuse to sign a compensation agreement. How do you proceed? No offer? What if your buyer really wants the house?
I was just gonna say,
That's not in the best interest of your client. Your client wants to buy the house.
yeah, that's-
Okay. Go ahead. Ask the question. And because this is what these sessions are about. You have to just kind of work through various scenarios.
If I
Okay.
had a buyer that sale, the way I, in my mind, intend to go forward is to explain to them, in that case, we need to make sure we find more than one home that you really like. And then when I come to the listing agent, because your home is now sitting on the market for 60 days and you're biting your fingernails a little bit, I'm gonna say, we went out and looked at 10, 15 homes, we've narrowed it down to 2. Your listing is one of them, but my buyers need to know if you're gonna sign a compensation agreement, so I'm sending one over to you. And that's how I would put it, because, you know,
Don't let them think
Don't-
they're the only.
right,
Yeah.
it's no longer COVID time, you know, you're not getting 5, 6 offers on your home all at one time. You're hoping for that contract to come in, that conversation to start somewhere. So you know what, I mean, if your sellers have said, we're not offering anything, then tell me your sellers aren't offering anything. If they are offering something and I send a compensation agreement over and it's not what they're offering, come back to me, you know, and say, that's more than my buyers are willing to pay. But you need to, I mean, I think we all agree that you want to start the conversation so that you can get to the end result of selling your client's home. And the market is in a little bit of a different position. So wouldn't you sign it? Wouldn't you send it back?
I would say the only exception would be if that seller has said no at the very beginning.
very
it's
beginning.
buyer mission, but they'll consider it. Well, now we need the offer to consider it.
I don't agree that you do need. the offer.
I'm just
They
saying that's
said-
what by sellers.
That's what the sellers, yeah, that's what the
thinking.
seller feels.
Well, then, if I had a seller like that, and their house has been sitting for a while, and they don't wanna go down on the price, and somebody's coming to me with a compensation agreement, I'm gonna go back to my sellers and say, we wanna get this conversation started. Do you wanna revisit this, or do you want me to tell them you're not offering anything? And with the chance that they're gonna go to the other home that they've picked out.
Mm.
That's my point of view on it.
But going back to when you first started your response, what I liked about your response initially was my buyers need to know, right? It's not, I as an agent need to know whether or not I'm getting paid,
Right.
right? We need to be very careful with how we're phrasing these things, right? Because again, it's not about us. It's not, I need to know whether or not I'm getting paid on this transaction. My buyers, okay, need to know right, in order to decide whether they can move forward with this purchase, right? In order to decide whether they're able to move forward with this purchase, they need to know whether or not your seller's offering compensation, and if so, how much.
Right.
Right, because it's all about the buyer's ability to move forward with that transaction.
And I really like, and we've talked about this before, how you're not, your buyer's not desperate to have their house. You know, we have this other option over here. So they don't think they hold all the power, you know, oh, well, your client really wants this house. Well, no, not really. They like this house, but they have this one also that they
But
really
they
like.
may
So.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
I would not say we have to. If I have a buyer that this is their home and this is their dream home, then my conversation is gonna be a little bit different with you. And that my clients are very interested, but they do need to know if you can offer any compensation, so we know how to structure our offer to you. Obviously, everything is negotiable, but I need a place to start,
Yeah.
or we have to move on and try to find something else, you know?
And there's some here, so I don't know if I can do. When I said no offer, I meant without going back to speak with my buyers. Because they signed.
We know what you
brokerage
really meant,
agreement.
Elena. You're like, no offer. We know what you really meant. Just kidding.
She is so self-absorbed. Not really. No,
We know what you
because
meant.
They signed the agreement to begin with, so I want to go back to them and say, are you comfortable? Are you, you know, we talked about this in the beginning. That there may be a possibility that you'll have to pay, you would be responsible for my compensation. That's where I was
Right.
going with it.
And remember, we need to also be having these conversations with our buyers up front,
Mhm.
right? Because if
Yeah,
there's a
I'm thinking
concern
about
that they
it.
may not be able to, depending on the scenario, right? The seller may or may not be offering compensation. So these are conversations that we need to be
Mhm.
having with our buyers up front at the time that we're signing the buyer agency agreement, right? If we come across a home, if you fall in love with a home, right, where the seller is not offering compensation, and you're telling me you cannot afford the compensation, how would you like to proceed?
And you're talking the other day, you might need to get proof of funds.
Correct.
You don't feel that they can actually.
Right, if you don't feel they can, you may want proof of funds, but then again, now I'm asking for proof of funds to verify that they can pay me. See, so then, in my mind, now it's all the ethics of it, right? I'm supposed to be helping you find a house, but now I want proof of funds just to make sure that you can pay me before I even show you property. So that's an ethical sort of dilemma, and for me, that's an ethical dilemma.
I think it also a way to like circumvent it a bit is having them pre-qual or something like that, and then you could ask the loan officer, do you think they could, or in their budget? You know,
Right, well, that's going to be crucial, right?
Mm.
Speaking with those lender partners is going to be crucial to
Mhm.
see how much they can afford and whether or not they, we
What homes
can.
do we show that?
Right.
Right.
Where the. proof of
But
funds
sometimes
are.
you'll have to ask the difficult question, if the seller is not offering compensation, if we know that you cannot afford it, do you want me to show that house? Or not, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
It's not up to us to decide, it's not up to me to decide, well, that seller's not offering compensation. I'm not ever gonna show a house where the seller's not offering compensation. It's the buyer's decision, right?
Before you go to a listing, to find out if your seller's offering compensation.
I am, call or text. The listing agent, is your seller offering compensation? If so, how much?
And have you had
Right.
say, just send us over the offer on your compensation agreement?
So far, I've two instances, and in both cases, the listing agent has been very straightforward and said, yes, they're offering compensation and it's this much.
Also, office agents, most of the time.
Correct.
They have both sides.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think everyone wants to. play
Can you,
nice.
is there a way to roll it into the mortgage or no?
So we were talking, and it was here earlier, yes, but there are limits, right? There are limits with how much, seller concessions, and it depends on the type of loan that they're getting, and it depends on the amount of down payment. And there are, Ed left some of these here, so you can take that with you. Oh, you okay. So it depends on the type of loan, and it depends on the down payment, up to how much, right? That the seller concessions that they can accept.
So, let's say you wind up having to go that route and you put it in concessions. And they already need some concessions for, closing or whatever. You get the home inspection and something comes back that your sellers aren't willing to fix it. Or they want to compensate with money as opposed to fix it. Now you've got to roll that number into, and is that going to be coming out of your concessions, which is to me another reason why, back to the compensation agreement.
Right, and that's another reason why it's best to have a separate compensation agreement, rather than trying to work it through concessions. Because let's say you're asking for, as you said, you're asking for $10,000. Whoops, that's too many zeros, $10,000 in concessions. Right now, depending on whether or not your concessions were advertised, right? I may be able to add $10,000 here, put $10,000 on that second line, saying that all of it can be used toward broker compensation. But if those seller concessions were advertised, then we know that we cannot use that entire amount. So on this second line, we have to have a lesser amount, right? So let's say seller concessions were advertised, right? $9,999. So let's say we're going to put, I don't know, $8,000. Okay, $8,000 of the $10,000 seller concession can be used toward broker compensation. Now we get an inspection, and there are repairs that the seller is not willing to pay for. And your buyer needs money to get to the closing table, right? So that's going to complicate, right? That's going to complicate your transaction. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Into this, wouldn't have complicated the transaction to begin with. Is it really any different? It's just.
Well, it is, because
presenting it
prior to
more-
this, if I ask for $10,000 in concessions, that's all going to my buyer. Right, but now we're saying of these $10,000, we're using 8,000 of those dollars to pay me. Right, so they're really only getting, the buyer is truly only getting $2,000 in concessions. That's what's going to the buyer, right, which may or may not be sufficient for them. Right. Or think about the effect it would have. Let's say it's a higher list price property, and think about the effect it would have, because it's also about how is that offer going to be perceived. And I think yesterday you had used some with a higher figure, 16,500 was 20,000. So we're asking for $20,000 in concessions, of which I want to use 16,500 of that to compensate my broker, my buyer's agent. But think about, as a seller now, we have to be cognizant of that. Think about, as a seller receiving that offer, how is the seller going to react if we're asking for $20,000 in seller concessions versus seeing 3% on a compensation agreement, right? So again, ultimately, I think it's best that we have our compensation addressed through a compensation agreement. Send it before you send that offer, so that you know ahead of time how to address and whether or not you have to address it ultimately in the offer, right? Because if we have the signed compensation agreement, we don't have to worry about addressing it in seller concessions at all, right? For me, that seller concession is going to be a last resort kind of scenario, right? I'd rather have it addressed through through the compensation agreement, and then as a last resort, use seller concessions only if I have to. And I would rather use those seller concessions to benefit the buyer, and not to address my compensation.
And I think the other important thing is to just, in your mind moving forward, to think, I'm gonna present, a compensation agreement, and that agent is going to work with me. Not that they're gonna try to hide everything, and it's gonna be this hide and go seek thing between two
Well, they
agents.
need
And I think-
buyer's agents.
Right, and I
Listing
think,
agents need buyer's agents and agents need listing agents. Yeah. Or there wouldn't be any transaction.
So think about it, for those of us that are listing agents, okay, the education starts there as well, right? Let's have honest conversations and transparent conversations with our sellers, and why it may benefit them, right, to offer that buyer broker compensation, why it's beneficial. Because really nothing,
I've always seen that because we always had to do the split on, on
On the listing agreement.
Yes, I just had that conversation, so, I mean, it's not hard for me to continue to have it, it's just there's different ways of going about it now, I guess, because there's some other paperwork that's gonna come in from, buyer's agents, where we didn't see that before.
right, the only thing that has changed is that we're going to receive a compensation agreement. From the buyer's side. Nothing, when you really think of it, nothing has truly changed.
Right.
We're still going to continue to have those same conversations on the seller side, right? The only thing is now we may, well, for those agents maybe who were not as transparent with their sellers, right? In the beginning, now they have to be fully transparent and explain the benefits of offering that buyer broker compensation, right? But other than that, really, nothing has changed, other than we have to present a compensation agreement. It's really status quo. We're just, I think we're working ourselves up, right? But it's just an extra piece of paper.
Yeah.
The practice, how we have practiced real estate is not changing. The law has not changed. How we have practiced for years is going to remain the same. We just have to make sure that we're having the appropriate and more transparent conversations with our sellers, rather than saying, I charge 6%. And then it's up to me to share however much of it with a buyer's agent. That's never been the case. It should have never been done that way when you think of it, right? It really is, this is my fee, and then would you like to compensate a buyer's agent? Would you like to compensate a buyer's broker? You have the option to. They've always had the option to do so or not do so. Wow, quiet.
I guess because I'm so new, I'm really brand new, but I don't feel like this is hard, except for that, one extra document. Because it's the only way I know,
Right, that's the only way you know.
so. I feel
It's
like
it's
this is
just those of us that have been doing it for a little bit longer have to get used to. But I don't think it's more so about the conversations that we're having than it is about the paperwork. Although I do believe that the lawyers have made the paperwork a little muddy, but that's besides the point. Again, that's a conversation for a different day. But it's more about the conversations we're having with our clients, buyer clients and seller clients, than it is about the paperwork. Do we have something to chat?
We'll make this.
Harry says we survived TRID, we can survive this. About a year and a half ago, when did we move to due diligence? Was it a year ago in March? When we moved to due diligence in South Carolina, and we all thought the world was coming to an end, right? And we all got through it, and we're doing just fine. And no, due diligence as in due diligence period. Prior, we didn't have the way we have it now. So you never knew that either. We had a different, right? So the only option we have now is due diligence, which is what you've learned. But prior to that, the contract was different. But that was a huge adjustment for everyone, right? And we're all here. And we're still thriving, and nobody thinks twice about it.
I had a broker's license before that, so I was used to due diligence there, but.
I do think there's a little bit of a difference because national news didn't talk about due diligence.
Right, that's
Right,
right.
that's
They
the other
weren't
thing.
getting that. So
false narrative out
It's not
there.
over every paper, newspaper, every. Keep in mind, yeah.
There's some bad actors, that's why I think people are getting, I know I'm getting, I'm against some bad realtors that
Yeah.
would take advantage of this.
Mhm.
Counsel their sellers to say, oh, no, you can't do that.
Yeah. And we're gonna run into that, unfortunately.
Yes, yes, we are.
We're gonna run into that. But
But that's the nature of every profession, right? Change is just, it's a part of our everyday lives. But it's a matter of how, it's just our approach, right? We can't be afraid of
It's
it.
gonna come down to, we're relationship minded, a lot of us, and, that's the way we've always done business, and with, whether it's with our clients or with other agents. We build relationships with those other agents, and, so you're hoping that you still have those relationships in place when, you try to make offers and stuff. So.
But it comes down to the education, right? It's all about educating your client from the very beginning. Because if they have a clear understanding of the process, right, then we're not having to deal with hiccups down the line. If we're educating our sellers properly from the very beginning, at the time they sign that listing agreement, then we won't have to worry about what's going to happen down the line, right? If we're educating our buyers, properly about how we are going to get compensated and the things that you might have to do, then it won't be as big of an issue. It comes down to the conversations that we're having with our clients.
And the more you have up front with them, the
Correct.
easier it will be. to come up with that situation down the road.
Right. Present the different scenarios. If the seller is offering compensation, great. If they're not offering compensation, these are the various things that we can expect, right? We can try to negotiate through concessions. We may not, if that doesn't happen, then this could happen. But if we educate them upfront, right, then they are not surprised. They are not shocked, right? And they've had time to think about what they're going to do, okay, in the event that scenario should materialize. That's all I've got.
We're gonna have
Any
another
questions?
class at the end of the month, it's like 2 weeks, I think, from now. Just 29th, just to go over any situations you guys have come up against in these. Since the
Right.
change.
So for example, yesterday, the one case that we had talked about at yesterday's session, there was an agent who received an offer. They represent the seller. They received an offer and they had received a compensation agreement for 3%, which the seller agreed and signed. So the seller had agreed to the 3%. Then the offer arrived, and in the concessions, okay, they had an amount of concessions that they were requesting, which was also equal to 3% of the purchase price.
So were they actually asking for votes, or they?
So they were asking, I don't know if were they confused? They were confused, right? So they had it both as in the compensation agreement and then asked for it in the seller concessions. And so it's either one or the other. And again, ideally, it's the compensation agreement. Okay, so then if we have to negotiate truly for concessions on behalf of our buyer, then we can do it through the concessions. But in that case, they were confused.
And if they had signed that, they would have been paying 6%, double, right, in addition to what they owed their agent, their listing agent.
So can I throw one more thing out there?
Yep.
Okay. So you have the listing and the buyer comes in and they want 3%, your seller's only willing to do 2%. They want to raise the purchase price to cover that 1%, right? So now, and I didn't think about this before, but it's actually going to cost your client even more, because where they would be paying deed stamps on this price, now you're raising that price, and you not only want my client to pay you additional compensation, but now they increase the amount of their deed stamps. So it's additional, right, an additional, yeah, I know, but it's additional cost for them, yeah,
Yep.
all around. I
And that's
mean,
something to show your seller.
right,
Maybe
Yeah.
it's better for us to do the 3% versus raising that price to get that extra 0.5%.
right.
Well, and remember, your seller's gonna be a buyer.
Maybe.
Or maybe, right? Or they were a buyer.
Mhm.
Did they pay their buyer broker commission when they bought that house? now that they're selling it.
I just had that come, we just had that come.
I don't know. Did I?
Yeah, that's what they said.
I have referred,
I said, if you
I
have
have
a settlement
referred-
statement, I'll let you know.
well, that's, I have referred them to their settlement statement.
Well, I
you
had
know.
printed out the
The
old
listing,
listing,
the old
and I said,
listing.
see, this is what's going, this is what the change is, right here, it shows you paid. 3% was paid to your buyer broker, whether you know it or not, it came out of the proceeds of the house. And that's what, has changed, is this number's no longer there. And so we have to handle it a little bit differently. But then the other question was, on the, we charge whatever, 6%. And then you come to the next section and, do you want to offer a buyer broker compensation? And it's up to, and the question was, so if we aren't paying the buyer broker 3%, then does that change what I pay you?
It doesn't. If you put 6% on that first page, they're paying Innovate 6%.
Well, her question actually was worded, so then that means I wouldn't be paying you 6%. Is
Right.
actually what she worded the question.
Which then they would change that first line.
And then you would change the first
30%.
line from 6 to whatever else it would be just for your side of the transaction. Because if 6% is on that first page, they are paying a total of 6%. I often would get that question, because they would agree to compensate a buyer broker, let's say 3%, but a transaction broker less than that, let's say 1%. And so then they would ask, well, if they come with a transaction broker, am I only paying 4%? If I'm paying 3% on the listing side and 1% for a transaction broker? I said, no, because you are agreeing to a total of 6% or 5% or 10%, whatever the case may be. So that is what you're paying, regardless of how the buyer comes to the transaction. That is the total compensation that you're paying.
And then we want to make sure that those numbers match buyer's agent and transaction brokerage, because,
They don't have to match.
well, you could wind up as a transaction broker.
Mhm.
Right, and so if you get to the listing and they're only offering 1%, I mean, I would try to match it. I just always have done it that way, and I would try to match it to whatever the buyer broker is, the transaction broker. Because we know that we're gonna get instances where buyers, either you wind up in dual agency and you need it, so you wind up being the transaction broker and the seller's broker, right?
Why wouldn't you give the 2% back to the seller if you're the transaction broker?
Well,
So I just had that situation this morning with one of our agents.
Mhm.
She has an agent from another state that has come to her and said, I want to make an offer on your listing,
Mhm.
but I don't want you any representation. So our agent represents the seller, and this agent from another state is just making an offer. So I told our agent, sign transaction broker agreement with her. Let her know that she is a customer.
Mhm.
Now, the listing agreement says a total of 5%, of which 1% would be given to a transaction
Transaction.
broker. So I told the agent, I said, so in reality, you could save your client 1% by working for a total of 4.
Correct.
Meaning you're working for 3 as a listing agent and 1 as
one.
a transaction broker agent. I said, but you don't have to, but if you're looking out for your client's best interest,
Right.
that's what I would suggest.
Right.
Because it's actually saving your client 1%. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
But per the listing agreement, she doesn't have
She
to
doesn't
do
have
that.
to.
She could get the whole 5, meaning she could get 4 as the buyer, as a listing agent and 1 as the transaction broker. But we're supposed to be looking out for client's best interest, so she should offer that back to
That
her
back to the
seller.
seller.
I don't understand that if people giving pushback for the total, say of 5, you say, well, if we bring on somebody on representing both sides, we can discount it further. So you have to do that, but it's benefiting them and it's also helping them to want to sign.
Well, and not only that, as Kathy said, we're in a relationship, we're in a business that's based on relationships. Why not? I mean, that's goodwill. That seller is going to be more likely to recommend you and refer you over and over and over again because of that. It's good business. It's simply good business. I'm saving you money.
right.
And then I guess there would be some scenarios where that the benefit of a transaction, be saving your client money on the transaction brokerage. Maybe they would want representation more or like the reg, so they might say. And it's just on our end, how do we determine that it would benefit them more for you to represent them as just the seller's agent, or I guess it's just explaining it to them and just trying to gauge it, I guess, or.
I think the thought process is it's safer to do transaction broker versus dual agency.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because with dual agency, really, all of those fiduciary duties to both individuals, to both parties are now limited. Right, so
Okay.
you're truly not representing either one. You can't give advice to either one.
Or,
You're just a mediator at that point.
Oh.
Right? So you cannot advocate on behalf of one, or the other. If they're negotiating, you can't provide opinion or advice if you're a dual agent. So it really is hurting them, right, as a buyer or a seller, ultimately.
So you're thinking more from, if you're representing the seller and the buyer will go through you, do they need better representation?
no, not the buyer, the seller, I'm saying that.
They would have
Is
your
it-
representation.
Would it benefit the buyer, I mean, the seller more to have your full like representation of in the contract without where they're a full client and not just a customer?
The
Or
seller,
would the money be? Would the money, I guess, saving that 1% be more valuable than getting where, oh, I'm giving you advice on how to counter whatever the buyer says.
So I think on the seller side,
Yeah.
because remember, you represent the seller first,
Right.
then the buyer, so you would remain the agent
Right.
under an agency agreement with the
Right.
seller. You're bringing the buyer on as a customer,
Oh, okay.
but the
That's
seller
right.
remains a client,
That's actually.
right?
I always read the difference.
Right, so it's the buyer that would be coming on as the customer
Right.
subsequently,
Okay.
but the seller would remain a client.
That's right.
and Chris and I had that scenario where I went to her and
That's right.
I basically had the buyer from hell and didn't want to represent her. So we said we would do the transaction. And as it turns out, she bought something in the same neighborhood, but not this my listing. And I was so grateful because 2 weeks before closing, she ghosted me. She decided she wasn't going through with it and wouldn't talk. So I advised her to call her attorney, Tide Law Firm. And she did. She called the receptionist, said, I'm not going through with it. No. She wouldn't even talk to the lawyer.
Any questions from those of you that are at home? No. Any other questions? Okay. Any other questions from anyone here?
I'm
No?
online. This is David. Can you hear me all right? I had to switch to my
Yes.
phone.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting conversation the whole way, and I'm actually
Mhm.
called. I've got a license in 3 states and just starting in South Carolina. But I've been talking to some people here in Atlanta, and it seems like it is all about when you're listing. It's 2 different conversations we're talking about: listing agents and buyers agents. And the listing agents, I had a lady talk to me today, says I saw, she used to be a realtor and she's older now, so she says, I don't have to pay a buyer's agent anymore. I said, well, the question is, do you want to sell your house? And I was on a call the other day and I said, depends on your market and how bad you want to sell your house, because if you need those other buyers, you're going to have to put a good compensation out there for folks. If you're in a hot market and it would sell by itself, maybe you don't need as much. But yeah, I think it's back to the conversation. Each house has its own conversation.
Right.
Don't you believe?
I agree. But ultimately, I think it's always, because remember, if the seller truly wants to sell, whether it be in 30 days or in 60 days or in 90 days, they have a much higher probability of doing so, right? If they are offering that buyer broker compensation, because otherwise they would be limiting the pool of buyers, right, that can afford to purchase the home.
Oh, I agree. The National Association of Realtors says that, I don't know what it is today, but last year it was 90% of homes are sold by people with buyer's agents.
Mhm.
So if you don't put that compensation out there, you're eliminating 90% of your market. And I think that's a statistic that we have to use to our benefit to say, I don't want to eliminate 90% of your market if we're listing your house. So we need to put a compensation out there for these people who are working hard to have the same goal as you do, and that's to get your house sold and you move to your new house. So I think a lot of it's the communication that we really need to focus on. I don't agree it's the same as it used to be. And we said, well, I'll go as business as normal because there's too much fear in the market with agents right now. It's more a psychological thing. I'm taking my time and listening to all the different conversations and saying, how do I leverage my professionalism and my experience in the market to get what I need and get what my people need and be confident with it. So I think that's the big deal.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. You're welcome.
Been great conversations though on these calls that y'all host. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
I think the more we talk about it, the more we'll feel confident in what we're doing.
Yes, because again, as you stated, it's all about the conversations. And even if that means just sharing the experiences and the different scenarios that we're coming across right now on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and I think you got to realize too, I'm moving from Alpharetta, which is a very affluent part of Atlanta, to the coast, and here in the neighborhood I'm in, a lot of professional people. They're used to paying professionals for professional service and deserve good service. There's different markets that don't want to pay people. So you got to be careful what market you want to value your time and effort in.
That's true. Very true. I agree.
I took to Chrissy. She told me it's okay if we take about 10, 15 minutes after.
Let me just end this meeting.